Intensive agriculture is the single, most dramatic cause for the loss of biodiversity, species, and natural habitats in Europe. But what is intensive agriculture, and how does it affect the birds and other wildlife that depend on the land for their survival? Intensive agriculture is a form of farming that uses large amounts of inputs, such as pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation, machinery, and energy, to maximize the output of crops and livestock. It often involves monocultures, where only one type of crop is grown on large areas of land, or intensive livestock production, where animals are kept in high densities and fed with imported feed. Intensive agriculture has many negative impacts on the environment and biodiversity. It reduces the diversity and quality of habitats, such as grasslands, wetlands, and forests, that provide food, shelter, and breeding sites for many birds and other animals. It also destroys natural features, such as hedgerows, ponds, and trees, that create a mosaic of habitats and increase landscape connectivity. Intensive agriculture also affects the availability and quality of food resources for birds and other wildlife. It reduces the abundance and diversity of insects, seeds, fruits, and other plant materials that many birds rely on for their diet. It also contaminates the soil and water with chemicals that can harm the health and reproduction of birds and other animals. Intensive agriculture also contributes to climate change, which poses an additional threat to biodiversity. It emits large amounts of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, from the use of fossil fuels, fertilizers, and animal manure. It also reduces the capacity of ecosystems to store carbon and regulate water cycles. The consequences of intensive agriculture for birdlife in Europe are alarming. According to a study by scientists from 28 countries, the number of wild birds of all kinds across the continent has fallen by more than a quarter since 1980, but this decline deepened to more than half among farmland species. Birds that depend on insects for food, such as swifts, yellow wagtails, and spotted flycatchers, were the hardest hit. The European Environment Agency, EA, found in 2019 that agricultural intensification remains one of the main causes of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation in Europe. Many water bodies, particularly in regions with intensive agriculture and high population density, suffer from diffuse pollution, pollution caused by a variety of activities which have no specific point of discharge. The resulting eutrophication can manifest in biodiversity loss, increase in algae, and reduced oxygen levels. Intensive agriculture is not only bad for biodiversity, but also for human health and well-being. It depletes natural resources, such as soil, water, and genetic diversity, that are essential for food production and security. It also exposes people to harmful chemicals that can cause diseases and disorders. It also reduces the cultural and aesthetic value of landscapes that people enjoy and appreciate. Intensive agriculture is not sustainable or desirable for Europe's future. We need to shift to more ecological forms of farming that respect nature and support biodiversity. We need to reduce our dependence on external inputs and increase our reliance on natural processes and cycles. We need to diversify our crops and livestock and integrate them with natural habitats. We need to restore natural features and enhance landscape connectivity. We need to protect our climate and our ecosystems. We need to act now before it is too late for our birds and our planet. One of the main threats to Europe's birdlife is the use of pesticides and fertilizers in intensive agriculture. These chemicals have a devastating impact on the food sources for birds that rely on invertebrates, such as swifts, yellow wagtails, and spotted flycatchers. Pesticides kill insects and other invertebrates that birds feed on, reducing their abundance and diversity. Fertilizers promote the growth of crops and grasses, but also reduce the variety of wild plants and flowers that provide nectar and seeds for birds. In addition, intensive agriculture often involves large fields and monocultures, which reduce the availability of habitat for breeding and nesting. According to a study by more than 50 researchers, analyzing data from 28 countries over nearly 4 decades, intensive agriculture is the biggest cause of the decline in the continent's bird populations. They found that the number of wild birds of all kinds across Europe has fallen by more than a quarter since 1980, but that this decline deepened to more than half among farmland species. Birds that rely on invertebrates for food were the hardest hit, with numbers falling by 56.8% since research began. Some examples of these birds are swifts. These aerial insectivores can fly up to 200 days without landing, but they depend on insects for their survival. They have declined by 53% across Europe since 1990. Yellow wagtails. These colorful birds feed on insects and worms in wet meadows and pastures. They have declined by 68% across Europe since 1980. Spotted flycatchers. These small birds catch flying insects from perches in woodland edges and gardens. They have declined by 63% across Europe since 1980. These birds are not only important for the ecosystem, but also for the cultural heritage and enjoyment of people. They are indicators of the health of the environment and the quality of life. Their decline is a warning sign that we need to change our farming practices and protect their habitats before it is too late. The Common Agricultural Policy (CAP) is the EU's farming subsidies system, which takes up a third of the EU's entire budget. It is supposed to support the transition to more sustainable agriculture, but in reality, it does the opposite. It is an unjust system that subsidizes intensive farming and contributes to the climate crisis by destroying natural carbon sinks. The CAP pays farmers based on the size of their land, not on how they farm it. This means that the more farmland they have, the more money they get. As a result, 80% of direct payments go to only 20% of farmers, and 1/3 of direct payments go to a powerful minority of only 1.5% of farmers. This concentration of subsidies encourages the expansion and intensification of farming, often at the expense of small-scale and nature-friendly farmers. Intensive farming is a major threat to Europe's bird life and biodiversity. It involves the use of large amounts of pesticides, fertilizers, antibiotics, and water, which pollute the soil, air, and waterways. It also involves the destruction of natural habitats, such as ponds, trees, and hedges, which provide shelter and food for many species of birds and other wildlife. For several decades, the CAP has been a main driver of the decline of farmland birds in Europe. We have lost 57% of farmland birds in just 40 years. Some iconic species, such as the skylark and the lapwing, have declined by more than 60%. Intensive farming is also fueling the climate crisis. It produces large amounts of greenhouse gases, especially from the livestock sector, which accounts for over 71% of agricultural land in Europe. At the same time, it reduces the ability of natural vegetation to capture and store carbon dioxide. The CAP supports practices that are likely to cause environmental harm, such as plowing up grasslands and peatlands, which are important carbon sinks. By destroying natural habitats, the CAP also undermines the resilience of ecosystems and their capacity to adapt to climate change. The CAP is failing to deliver on its environmental and climate objectives. The new CAP strategic plans, CSPs, which are supposed to be the tools to implement the CAP at national level, are far from what is needed to address the numerous challenges related to food and farming. They are likely to continue supporting intensive farming and harming nature. The CAP's green architecture, which consists of conditionality, eco-schemes, and agri-environment climate measures, ACMs, is weak and ineffective. Conditionality fails to provide adequate protection for water, wetlands, and peatlands, and to create space for nature on farms. Eco-schemes fail to deliver environmental benefits, and are even likely to cause environmental harm. ACMs support fake schemes while effective schemes are underfunded or unattractive to farmers. The CAP needs a radical overhaul. It needs to stop subsidizing intensive farming and start supporting nature-friendly farming. It needs to reward farmers for delivering public goods, such as biodiversity conservation, climate action, and animal welfare. It needs to ensure that at least 10% of every farm in Europe is natural habitat. It needs to reduce the perverse subsidies to intensive meat and dairy production. It needs to align with the EU's Green Deal objectives and contribute to achieving the targets set by the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the Farm to Fork Strategy. It needs to be fair for farmers and taxpayers alike. The CAP is an incredibly powerful tool that can shape the future of European farming and nature. It can either continue driving us towards ecological collapse and social injustice, or it can help us transition towards a more sustainable food system that respects people and planet. The choice is ours.